And finally, certainly last but not least, we have Jess Pepper, the Climate Cafe founder and director, and she's going to be talking to us about climate action and the simple idea of the Climate Cafe, which is now a global phenomenon. So, right, we're coming to Jess now. So, Jess, over to you.
Wow, thank you. What a morning of presentations already. Yeah. Just thinking about all of these conversations, I'm going to bring it right back to a cup of tea and a biscuit, so I keep it simple. But yeah, just hugely excited to think about all the cups of teas and biscuits we can have, learning and sharing more of what we've all learned in the whole room. Thank you to TSI Murray. Really excited to be here and to listen to what's happening across the whole room and all the contributions that have been made already. I think you might recognise that a lot of what I'm going to share will chime with what you've heard already. I'm going to talk about climate. I'm not going to talk necessarily about the science and the impacts and the solutions for climate change, because that's another conversation. That's 8 minutes, but I think we're all aware that we're in a climate emergency and that we're needing urgent action, but in a connected emergencies, and that's what we see in our communities, complex issues all coming together at the one time. And what I'm going to share with you a bit is about a simple space called a Climate Cafe, where the conversation can start about how we're tackling climate change, what's happening in our own communities and what the opportunities are. My background originally is in advocacy and communications on climate change, but over the last decade I've been much more involved with climate action at a local level, personally in my own community, and then I had access to a resource that people found useful, which was about the science and the impacts and the solutions that I was able to bring to other communities, workplaces, schools, friend groups in their living rooms. And what I could see, so everybody maybe knew a bit about climate change. Some people would be real experts and some people would feel that they weren't expert at all. But what I discovered was that once folk had a sense of the update on the science and the impacts and the solutions, then they felt maybe more confident in their own knowledge. And once everybody in the room felt kind of on an even keel, then the conversations about what folk could do in their friend group or in their community or in their school suddenly became a really animated conversation. Most of the learning which I'm sharing with you today is as an observer, somebody who has seen these things happening in my community and then in other communities. So in 2013, I was busy being a mum, juggling life, and just aware that we weren't talking about climate. Then I was able to share this presentation amongst different communities in different settings. And when that conversation started, it was for everyone. It wasn't exclusive to those who felt that they knew all the information. It became about everybody in the place. And that became even clearer when I shared that deck of slides in my own community. There were about 30 people came and then were struck by the urgency of what we needed to do, but also the opportunities and the challenges which we might face. And folks started to stop me in the co-op or in the park or at the school gate and say, oh, I've had an idea, couldn't we connect up? And did you know so-and-so is doing this? And there's a new business doing that. And did you know they've been doing this for ages? And after about a dozen times, I thought, you guys need to be talking to each other. I'm just holding this conversation up. So as a community, we got together and said, listen, do we need a space to talk about this stuff? And that's really how Climate Cafe started. We thought, well, just create a space once a month. We'll give it a 6-month run. This was in June 2015, and the international negotiations on climate in Paris were happening at the end of that year, the COP21 negotiations, where the world came together to try and put a plan together to tackle the emergency. What we discovered was that people really valued that space. Within a year, it thrived, and within a year, more than 100 people had asked to be put on the mailing list to come along to the Climate Cafe. It turned out to be a really intergenerational space. Often the children were leading the conversation and the young people leading the projects and the programs as well. And the adults were listening in, and it was kind of changing that dynamic. And what we found was that this wasn't competing with anything. It was just a space. It was absolutely just a cup of tea where you could drink, you could chat, and you could act on climate. Either that might be something you've learned from somebody else or a business you could support or something you could do at home, or it might be something that the community wanted to do together. So for example, people were quite keen on doing something about plastics, but they didn't necessarily feel, 4 or 5 folk didn't feel that they had necessarily had all the information or the capacity to do what they wanted to do, and then somebody else came back to the community who did, and there was suddenly an initiative that went right across the whole village and then extended into other communities as well. And as this community met and talked about climate, and it became not taboo to talk about climate, other communities came to join the chat and found that it was hyper-local sometimes, and then at other times super global. And they chose to set up their own spaces in their own communities. And so you start to see clusters of these spaces, just impromptu pop-up spaces once a month normally, but that's been community-led, happening across communities. So there's now nearly 14 in Perth and Kinross where it started, and then it started to spread across Scotland, and then across Europe, and now internationally. And there's a global network, which we try to support with a website and connecting folk, but just nurturing that same magic that you'll all be aware of getting folk together, connecting for a chat, and those sparks of ideas and support and advice and all sorts of initiatives and projects that can happen when we all get together. So it continues to evolve, community-led. The global network call will probably happen from Elgin Station tonight when I go home, so it's nothing very complicated, it's all very simple. But it's just as simple as that. And what we've learned is that these simple spaces that are community-led, and that's essential. We've had a few folk want to roll them out across countries and regions, but actually the collective feel that this should continue to be community-led, because it's the local folk in their space who know each other and know what the opportunities are and who can make things happen and what can happen. And the remarkable thing is how much action has come out of climate cafes, where you think, oh, maybe there's not the volunteers, or there's not the capacity, there's maybe not the interest, and there's not the chat. Far from it. We've had gatherings where people rock up and they have a cup of tea and they say, oh yeah, we've not really been doing much. And then they go through the connections and the projects and the initiatives that they've been involved in and the people that they brought together and all the collaborations that are happening. And within half an hour, you get the impression that a government department would be happy with all the action that had been led by the community. And you start to see more folk joining the conversation. So over now 9 years, we've seen that sometimes a climate cafe can start a conversation about climate in a community. Other times it can sustain a conversation, so where there might be a thriving project on remaking or a growing project, and there's a space created just to have that chat, to widen the conversation and just have an informal get-together. Actually, other things pop up. So in a remake project, we're hearing all sorts of chat about home energy efficiency and growing and doing other things within the community and support for a refill shop and all sorts of things like that. So the action has been remarkable. Zero waste festivals, music festivals, food shares, community fridges, woodland partnerships. One organisation has now created 3 full-time jobs and reduced energy debt by £70,000, helping 3,000 households and installing 140 renewable devices. Just from a chat, creating an initiative that is now funded and is able to help a lot of people get out of fuel poverty and reduce emissions too. So positive, empowering, these connections that we've been hearing, talking about, gathering that momentum and generating hope. And they're inclusive, they're ensuring that every voice is heard. If you want to go and just listen, that's fine, but generally folk join the chat and every voice can be heard where they might not normally be heard. They're not competing, but bringing folk together. In one community, we know that they've brought about 50 groups or organisations together on their own. And it's essentially just a cup of tea. We've learned that the diversity of the gathering adds to the chat because everybody brings a different experience and different perspective, and that's really valued as well. And we've also learned, and of course none of this was planned, that people really value, and probably this is the thing we hear most, they don't feel so isolated. People feel that sense of agency, I would summarise it as. They feel connected. They feel that other people in their community care or want to change things for the better. It might not have a climate label on it, but it might be that there's other things that they can contribute together. But it's all achieving the same ends. It's shaping our communities, but led by those communities. It's nearly 9 years, as I say, since Climate Cafe started in Dunkeld and Burnham. The climate literacy at the time, the chat about climate, as I indicated, was really low, especially in my demographic. And now we've got about 100 people a week taking climate action. But it's all sorts of different things which yet might not have that label, but essentially they're all contributing to the same end. The children and the role in listening to children and young people has shifted, and there's more respect and understanding for children leading that conversation, which is really lovely to see. And these communities continue to support each other. But one observation, because folk might say, oh, is it all about individual action? And it's not. We're seeing systems changing because of all the contributions. And as you can imagine, if there's lots of chats and lots of communities and they're connecting up and the decision makers are hearing that, it's giving political space as well for organisations, decision makers, businesses even, to go further, to be bolder, because where they might have heard a couple of critical voices before, now they're hearing the gentle chat, constructive, accessible chat of lots and lots, hundreds, thousands of conversations all about what our future could look like and how we can collaborate and come together. So it's generating that goodwill. And what we see now is a sense of pride and folk feeling engaged and supporting each other and advising each other as well, which is addressing connected emergencies, not just climate, but building that resilience and connection within our communities. So there's so much we could talk about that connects with all of this. I was laughing as it was being mentioned about being messy. I'm sure that'll be a familiar thing. Community stuff is messy, and there is now a climate hub that supports communities to get started with their Climate Cafe if they so choose. And there's a brand that folk know that indicates a safe space, an accessible space in the broadest sense, not just, you know, being importantly accessible physically and audibly in all of those ways, but also in terms of accessibility to a free cup of tea and a biscuit. And language, everybody being able to converse in a language which is not sciencey and expert. And yeah, so much that connects with all the previous conversations. So I'll allow the conversation to start here, and I've just shared some images so you can get a feel for the informality of this space that benefits everybody.
Thank you very much, Jess.